Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this session on entrepreneurship in chemical industry by Dr. Dhananjay Dendukuri. The session will be moderated by Professor Abhijit Majumder, an esteemed professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering, IIT Bombay. Handing over to you, Professor Abhijit.
Thank you, Niranjan. So, good evening, everyone. We are today at the ChemVision AZeotropy 2021. And today we have the special guest with us, Dr. Dhananjay Dendukari. So, Dr. Dendukari has a stellar background. He did his BTech from IIT Madras, BTech in Chemical Engineering, and he got the Best Performance Award, all round Best Performance Award there. And then he joined for masters in University of Toronto, and then he did his PhD from Professor Patrick Dowell's lab at the MIT Boston. And after that, Dr. Dendukari started his own company called Achira Lab, situated at Bangalore, India. The purpose of Achira Lab is to make medical devices and point of care diagnostic tools and devices. So today we will listen from Dr. Dendukari regarding his journey. So welcome, Dr. Dendukari, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Abhijit. It's a pleasure to be at AZeotropy. Thank you to Niranjan and the entire team for inviting me to speak here. And the way I wanted to do this today is not make like a regular talk, like a seminar, but keep it as open-ended as possible. So I'm going to speak for about maybe 20 minutes or so that there's some context that you all have about what my own journey has been like in terms of entrepreneurship, being a chemical engineer. And then we can have an open session, of course, with Abhijit helping moderate it. So that's what I'm going to be doing. So I have some slides. I'll start with that. Okay. So you're able to see the slides now, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me go ahead then. So that's right. So my company, Achira Labs, is a medical devices, a diagnostics company. We are based out of Bangalore, and we are a technology company. That is, we kind of come up with our own technologies in the diagnostics and devices space, mostly focused on medical diagnostics, but also some other devices. We have pride ourselves on the fact that we are an innovative company. So in addition to manufacturing and marketing products, we also have several publications and patents to our credit. The company is actually co-founded by myself and Suri, who's also a PhD from Indian Institute of Science. And we've been supported over the years by both private and public funding from many people, including Government of India through BIRAC program, Grand Challenges Canada, and our investor Catamaran. So that's a little bit about Achira. And I think Abhijit already went through my own background a little bit, so I won't kind of repeat all of that again, but these are the rough dates. I just thought it's always helpful to know these things so that you can place in context, how many years I've been out of academia and so on, and where I am right now. I guess the one thing to mention at this point is, starting the company itself was not something that I came back to India to decide to start a company. That wasn't the idea. But when I came back to India, I joined actually this company called 𝐾𝐚𝐧𝐚𝐃𝐞𝐧𝐝 that was run by Suri. I was a lead scientist there for a few years. And then we spun Achira off as a separate company after that. So I've been running this company for the last 10 years now at this point. So just a little bit about what we are doing. And of course, right now, everybody who is in medical diagnostics or in healthcare in any way, everybody asks, so what are you doing about COVID, right? So I just thought, since it's such a topic of interest, I'll tell you very briefly what we're doing. So being a diagnostics company, we are really in the thick of things and making several products that are related to COVID. So one of them is an RT-PCR test that we're doing in collaboration with a company in Pune called GenePath. So we are actually manufacturing and marketing the test. and over 100,000 tests have been done using the kits that we have manufactured at this point. We also have an antibody test. So especially now that we're all reading about vaccination, one of the likely testing scenarios is that people will want to know whether they have generated the antibodies against the SARS-CoV-2. So we also have an antibody test that we've developed with support from Government of India. And that's something that we're hoping will be out in the market next month. And given that our main focus is actually in this point of care space, we are actually working on a smaller device and cartridge platform to do point of care assays that have the same sensitivity as PCR. So this is a LAMP assay on a cartridge and instrument platform for COVID. So these are a few different things that we're doing that are related to the pandemic. But prior, I guess, to the pandemic, really, our story as a diagnostics company is to focus on diagnostic tests for smaller labs, doctors' offices, and point of care contexts. So, if you just look at diagnostic testing today, there are these large reference labs which are full of automated equipment, and they probably occupy tens of thousands of square feet and are highly automated, need very few people to run. So these are your reference labs, but you also have testing that is done in kind of lower tier contexts. So it could be in a doctor's office, it could be in a small lab. Especially in India, you have many smaller labs which are just a few hundred square feet. So the products that Achira makes are focused on that segment, right? These collection centers and smaller labs. And by some counts, there are more than 1 lakh of these smaller labs across India. And it's not just in India, you find the similar kind of labs across Southeast Asia and also Africa and so on. So it's a fairly large segment that is, I would say, very growing in addition to the point of care or near patient setting. So what are the kind of tests, diagnostic tests, or rather what are the attributes of a diagnostic test that should be performed at the point of care? So as you can imagine, the first thing is it should be easy to use, especially if it's a home test. I'm sure many of you have seen people at home, for example, using a glucometer, right? And the glucometer is the idealized version of an easy test because you literally take a lancet, you take a small finger prick, and you put it on a strip and you load it in this glucometer, and that's all the user has to do. So what's embedded in that is that there are no other steps, right? Most other diagnostic tests, sorry, I have to interrupt here, but I keep hearing a beeping sound. Is that to be expected or something? Okay, now it's stopped. All right. So a diagnostic test should be easy to use and not have any timed or pipetting steps. What you mean by that is that many of these things have workflows which say, okay, now add reagent A, wait for 30 seconds, then add reagent B, and so on. So you don't want things like that. You want to be as easy as a home glucometer. You want very stable reagents. So many of these, especially biological reagents, need refrigerated storage. And obviously, that can be a challenge at a home environment. You want these to be fairly inexpensive so that they can be done regularly at home. And you want fast results. I guess this is the most important thing, that when you do this, you don't want to wait for more than 10 or 15 minutes for a result. Yet you want the same quality or close to the same quality as somebody expects in a reference lab setting. You want to be able to do this with capillary blood. Capillary blood is the blood that comes from a finger stick, as opposed to venous blood, which comes from your veins. So if you're at home, you can easily draw the capillary blood, but not the venous blood. And you want to be able to do panels of these, so multiple tests. So these are all some of the characteristics of a point of care test. And our ASICS platform, which is an immunoassay platform, basically immunoassays are tests for proteins. And so this platform has been built to test multiple different proteins from human sera or capillary blood at the point of care. So you have three things really in the technology platform. You have these sensors, which I'll talk about in a bit. You have a microfluidic cartridge into which you put those sensors, and then you have a small portable instrument to read the cartridges. So now, just going back a little bit in time, I did my PhD and finished in 2007. And at that time, I actually came up with a technique called flow lithography. I'll just play a small video of what that is. You can see that this flow lithography is basically a method to do photolithography and make these really small colloidal sized particles, so things that are hundreds of microns or lower, using photopolymerization. And so this technique actually is the basis of some of the work that we do at my company. And in some sense came back to India to try and see if we could use some of that in a commercially relevant product. So all you need to know at this point is that the flow lithography enables you to make hydrogel particles into which you can put proteins, you can put DNA, you can put enzymes, and so on. And each of those becomes effectively an individual sensor. So what we do is actually something quite simple. We make these cartridges, and this is a cartoon view of it, where we load these sensors, so these rectangular shaped particles. Each of those is an individual sensor, which does a different test. So when your blood sample or serum sample flows through the cartridge, it will actually react with these sensors and eventually produce a fluorescent signal. So that fluorescent signal, the fluorescence is proportional to the concentration of your analyte, like shown here. So you have a calibration curve where the x-axis is the concentration, y-axis is the fluorescence. You can kind of say, okay, if I have 1,000 millivolts of fluorescence, then it's this many units concentration. So you have a calibration curve. And you use this to actually calculate what the concentration of some analyte is. And these are, just different concentrations of some analyte. As you increase it, you have increasing fluorescence, and that's what is used to build this calibration curve. So we have a very sensitive sensing system that is able to measure things down to low picograms per ml, which means it can pick up extremely small quantities of something that are in blood or serum, which is necessary for a lot of blood testing. And a small aside into the chemical engineering world, I think you all may have heard of something called a Darm-Kohler number, especially if you are in your third or fourth year, and those who have done reaction engineering may have come across this number, which basically takes into account the balance between reaction and diffusion. So one of the interesting things is that these sensors that we make, you can see that when we actually make them like a disc, the fluorescence is widest around the edges. The strongest around the edges, and that's because of this competition between reaction and diffusion, right? So before your analyte can diffuse all the way into the center, it's actually reacting and forming the strong edge effect. So we can actually capitalize on that and make different shaped sensors like this, which give you a very strong and uniform signal. So just to tell you that we still use chemical engineering principles in some way, even in the products that we make today. So this is a very simple workflow. Like you take a finger prick of blood, you add it into our cartridge. Actually, you mix it with the reagent, you add it into the cartridge, and then load it and press start. And within 15 minutes, you get your results. Our first tests actually are a thyroid panel. So we do a combination of these three assays, T3, T4, and TSH on this cartridge and reader system, where you're able to actually then diagnose the status of the thyroid of a person. And thyroid disease is something that's fairly widespread, and about 8% of Indians are implicated in thyroid in some way. And actually, it's also implicated in multiple other diseases, including infertility, diabetes, and so on. So it's an important test. That's why we've chosen it. We actually work with pharma companies who sell thyroid drugs, for example, to enable them to do doctor's office tests for thyroid. So that's the kind of business context that we operate in. And this is a cartridge showing you these different sensors for TSH, T4, and T3 inside one of the cartridges. This is in some of our customer locations. It's what our first version of our instrument looks like. We have now a much more smaller, portable version of it. In addition to that platform, the hydrogel sensor and cartridge platform, Achira, being an R&D company, does a couple of other things. We also have a fabric-based platform. So we were the first people to really think about making sensors on woven fabric. So we actually coat yarn with reagents, and then we weave it on a loom, and then actually make patches of fabric like this that can be cut into individual strips and then be made into sensors. And we're also kind of converting our platform into a molecular diagnostic platform now, which means genetic gene kinds of tests. Tests for different genes can also be done, including something like COVID, on our instrument platform. So these are two other things. Broadly, we're a diagnostics company, so we're kind of building different types of diagnostic tests, you could say. So that's really in a nutshell what the company does. And now coming more to, I guess, entrepreneurship and all of this, I have a couple of slides that I just thought I will use to set the context. And I noticed that even your backdrop for this has a refinery. And of course, whenever you think of chemical engineering, I think for a lot of lay people, the first thing that comes into mind is refineries, petroleum refineries, large reactors, process control, and so on. And obviously, chemical engineering has also evolved a lot over the years. And I know many of your own faculty members, including Abhijit, are doing some really exciting research in some of the newer areas of chemical engineering, including micro and nanotechnology, surface science, tissue engineering. So the world of chemical engineering has really evolved. So this is lab on a chip, the kind of area that I'm involved in. We're thinking about taking a large diagnostic lab, and converting all of those functionalities into one credit card sized chip. Today people are looking at a lot of protein folding, for example, problems or simulation problems of that kind, or 3D printing as applied to, for example, printing tissue engineering applications, new materials. So there are lots of exciting things happening in the world of chemical engineering. A lot of it tends to overlap with biology today. But I guess when you think of entrepreneurship, there could be so many different things, first of all, to start with for a chemical engineer, so many different things to choose from. And I think some of the things that stand out, no matter what, is I think as chemical engineers, we're all taught about this systems approach, control volumes and mass balances and all these things that I'm sure that you've all learned. And I think no matter what you do, whether it's finance or public policy tomorrow, some of these things stay with you. And I think this approach of thinking about what inputs and outputs is actually very useful in all of these different contexts and stands you in good stead no matter what you do later in life. And so that's why you find chemical engineers doing so many different things today beyond petroleum refineries and designing reactors and things like that. So in terms of actually chemical engineering entrepreneurship, I was just thinking about it a little bit before this talk today. And I guess the first thing to mention is that, we're all influenced a lot by what happens in a place like the US because it's so much in the news. But I think entrepreneurship in the US is obviously very different from entrepreneurship in India. So if you think about, the typical technology startup in the US, right? The way that you would think about it is a place like the US markets are very mature, right? There's Dow's and DuPont's and Johnson and Johnson's and Philips and all these very large companies that already exist. And it's very difficult today in the US for a small company to kind of come into a more mature and traditional market and actually take on these larger companies, correct? So what typically tends to happen when you say, what happens out of companies that come out of MIT or Stanford, you usually are focused on one small technical problem, correct? And then you solve it in some limited context, and then you actually hope that J&J or Philips or somebody comes and thinks this is interesting enough to acquire and put into their portfolio. That's the typical approach for entrepreneurship in the American context, at least when you think about engineering entrepreneurs, right? India is quite different, and especially all of you who are just coming out of college now, in some sense, while there's a lot more challenges in India, there's also a lot more white spaces, right? Many industries are still not so mature in India. Even, for example, quite commoditized items. You might be making, polymers, or you might be doing some building, fermenters. There are many of these things are not as mature, obviously, as the US, which means the markets are a little shallow. So if you took a long-term view of things, even in these traditional kind of places, there are gaps in the market for entrepreneurs today, right? Somebody could dream of building a company in India, even in a traditional space, is what I'm trying to say, I guess. But on the other hand, you have to also think about it, and from your own point of view, that you want to focus on a business innovation in a mature space like that, or do you want to focus on technology innovation, which is in a more nascent space? And business innovation in mature spaces, for example, if you talk about pharma or renewable energy, for instance, right? These are both very hot areas today. And a couple of obvious points stand out about things like that. If you want to be an entrepreneur in those kinds of spaces, the first thing is you need a lot of capital, right? And we're talking about maybe even hundreds, if not thousands of crores to do something meaningful in those kinds of spaces. And that kind of capital is not easily available in India today from VCs, and is also likely available to people that have experience and have worked 15, 20 years in those kinds of spaces, right? And have demonstrated some significant capability that they will then go and do that again. On the other hand, technology innovation, which is probably the thing that we are all more interested in, is, I think, best done out of academia. It needs a very supportive environment because a lot of things actually fail, and you would like to have access to some risk capital through government funding, grants. You want small, focused teams that are, have the smarts to pull off something. So that's the kind of innovation we're talking about. This is still quite new to India, right? And I think things have dramatically changed since even I started on this about 10 years ago to now. This whole innovation ecosystem has really blossomed. So you have agencies like BIRAC, and then of course you have DST, DBT. They're all funding so many different things today, and there's a lot of encouragement of startups over the last 10 years. However, I will still point out that most of those tend to be in the traditional spaces. The most successful companies that all of you read about in the news tend to be in the, have a significant digital type of component to them, right? And in the more brick and mortar hardware chemistry kind of space, you don't hear that many stories, and it's also borne out by the fact that there is, not that many success stories and exits and multi-billion, $1 million things happening yet, right? So we still have some ways to go over there. And I think one of the things there is you do need larger companies to actually come and support some of these efforts, and we can, I guess, talk about that a little bit more. So that is in terms of, I would say, just kind of differentiating a little bit between the kind of innovation you want to do, technology innovation versus business innovation. A few other points that I have here, and just in terms of starting your own company, I think I've put some of them on here. I think a couple of things that I highlight is, biology, chemistry, hardware innovation is expensive. You can't just, sit in your apartment with your friend and come up with something meaningful very easily, right? Unless you have some significant infrastructure, you can't easily do things. So that's definitely there's a higher threshold to be achieved in terms of success. You don't also kind of get fated in the media like some of these other stories, consumer type of stories, right? You're not going to see a Swiggy or an Ola or something like that in these kinds of spaces. But I think we also need a lot of, quieter but successful, maybe $50, $100 million type of companies to deepen the economy in India. So I think you should also be aware of that. I think a lot of things have actually improved. Some of these challenges, which I wrote down 4 or 5 years ago, have actually improved a lot for the better. So for instance, if you're doing anything in the hardware space today, I think getting precision engineering and sub-assemblies and so on used to be a significant problem. It's still a challenge, but things have gotten a lot better in India now. You have a lot of maker spaces. You have people with access to, from 3D printers to CNC micro machines and so on. So some things have definitely improved. I think one of the other challenges is really managing very interdisciplinary kind of companies. For instance, we're in a diagnostics company, you need to have a strong knowledge of, let's say, microfabrication for the microfluidics, assay development, which is biology, also instrument development. So I think building all of those skill sets together is still challenging in India simply because we don't have very, I would say, deep skills easily available in all of these. Our path to hardware products is also extremely long. I think this is probably the biggest challenge, that by the time you come up with something meaningful, it could easily be 7, 8, 10 years. That's not completely normal even in the US. So you need people with deep pockets and a very long vision to support these kinds of efforts. And that is not easy to find, I would say, even at this point in India. I think, but for those of you who are looking to start out, there's a lot of options today. There's so many incubators. I'm sure IIT has its own incubator. I know NCL Pune has a really popular incubator. There's multiple ones in Bangalore, CCamp and IBAB and whatnot. So for people with some ideas today, I think there's actually a lot of options to go, and get some space for cheap and actually work on your ideas with access to some shared hardware, for example. A lot of it tends to be focused on the bio side, I would say. less on maybe the traditional classical chemical engineering. That's probably more difficult to do. But there's a lot of things that are now available on this side. So that's something that is certainly a positive from 10 years ago to now. And these are some of the funding agencies. I think many of you may have heard. And I also, when I Googled this Nidhi Prayas, I realized that it's actually sort of almost centered in IIT Bombay from what I could see. So probably all of you know about them. But there are multiple other funding agencies. So today to raise, let's say, I would say between $50 and $100,000, so 20 to 50 lakhs kind of money to just try out an idea is something that's much more easily available than it ever was. That's a good thing for all of you. There's also lots of angels, including Mumbai angels, who are always on the lookout for supporting efforts and so on. So that's certainly changed. I will stop at this point, and maybe we can then convert to more of a Q&A format.
Just a minute. Yeah, thank you, Dhananjay. It was really nice, and you have covered a whole lot of area in this small time, and it was really encouraging. I have a couple of questions that participants already they sent to me, but some of those questions you have covered, but still I will kind of go through that. But before that, a few questions from my side to start with. So the first question I would like to ask, being a researcher myself, how do you find the right idea? We always get many ideas, but how do you think, oh, this is the right idea I should pursue?
Yeah, I think you could write a book about that question. And I think, Abhijit, the answer really is that, you should maybe think a little orthogonally, first of all. I think the story of Bob Langer is something that's told a lot at MIT, that in the 1970s, when he finished his PhD, it was a polymer engineering or whatever he did. And he went and did his postdoc in a hospital, which was unheard of at that point, right?
Yes.
And people said, as an engineer, chemical engineer, what are you doing in a hospital, right? But he said, no, I want to go and find out what the problems are. And that's how this whole field of drug delivery effectively happened, right? So I think working with people who are a little bit orthogonal to you, whether it's in, agriculture or climate change or medical side, of course, who are looking at real problems, right? I think you want to start backwards from an important problem. This is obviously the key thing here. Rather than linearly move forward from what you have, right? And as you know, there's a famous thing about a hammer in search of a nail,
Yes.
or a nail in search of a hammer. But I think a lot of times what tends to happen is we come up with something interesting as researchers, and then you're looking for an interesting application area, which is natural, by the way. I think that's how research should happen also, curiosity-driven research. But then you have to, I think, make that extra effort to go outside of your comfort zone to find good problems. And then I think naturally that marriage will happen. It takes some work though.
Yeah, actually, in fact, a few days ago, I was listening to Professor Jeff Karp's talk, Bob Langer's student, on a TED Talk. And Jeff was also talking about, the finding the right problem, and as well as to look for something. So he was talking about something as radical simplicity. He said that if I can find a solution which is complex, I will not be probably able to take it to the market. To take it to the market, I need to think of something very simple and easy to use. You have also touched upon that. And like I recall when you first was talking about this fab chip, fabric lab on fabric kind of idea. I think on 2015 in IIT Bombay. So it was like really thrilling. So what's your take on that when the students, they start to, think of newer research problem, including the, the PhD students, simplicity and frugality. So how do you kind of look into that?
Yeah, I think that, definitely simplicity is obviously a good one. I think especially if you are looking at, solving mass kind of problems. I think it's always a tough one, especially when you're talking about setting a PhD student's problem, and you know better than I do that ultimately they have to also get a good publication in a good journal and all of those things, right? And sometimes these high impact problems in the public sphere may not necessarily overlap with innovation as measured by the traditional metrics of
That's why I am asking you. You have done both. You got the best PhD dissertation award from MIT, as well as you have converted that into a company, a product. So you are the right person, actually.
Well, I wish I had a magical answer to this question, but I think, yeah, you want to certainly kind of find a good. I think you want to go backwards from solving a good problem. Fundamentally, once I think you're talking about a company, I think companies are creatures that need to ultimately exist to make money, right? And I think if that is not satisfied, then yeah, it's in some sense, then you should be in a non-profit or be in academia or something. So you need to find something which is going to actually make enough money for your shareholders and investors. That's obviously very important. And the good thing in some sense, Abhijit, is that in India there are so many problems. We're
Yes.
surrounded by problems all around us.
Yeah.
And which is why I said also something that I said was that you don't have to do some radical innovation in India. There are so many white spaces even in traditional sort of solved problem areas, right? Where just better reach, better pricing, just better crafted products, all these things could build a successful business. You do not have to reinvent the wheel in India necessarily if you just want to make money as a company.
Really, that's true. So there is one question from the audience side. Pravesh wants to know a little bit more on your sensor on fabric, that technology.
Oh, sure. So let me see if I think I stopped sharing, right? That's fine. Okay. Basically, the idea, Pravesh, is that a lot of people have worked on paper microfluidics. If you're familiar with any of the academic literature here, there's a lot of work on paper microfluidics from the 2000s even. In fact, there's a person called George Whitesides, you should look him up, that was sort of the inventor of this whole paper microfluidics area in some sense. And the idea basically was that can you come up with a capillary medium that is a self-absorbing medium, which doesn't need external pumps and so on, to pull liquids in, right? If you think about, again, the glucometer, that's the reason why it's very simple. You don't need a pump to push your blood in. It just wicks in, correct? So when I returned to India, I said, okay, can we do something which is also an absorbing medium, but maybe has more sort of manufacturability in the Indian context. And as we all know, textiles is a big industry in India. So, that's kind of how the idea came that can we look at fabric as opposed to paper? And the nice thing about fabric, by the way, is that you can actually do a lot of interesting things, both in terms of material selection. So as we all know, there's so many different materials, whether it's silk or nylon or cellulose. I mean, there's literally 100 different kinds of yarns available. And you can also change the properties of the yarns, including their thickness, effectively, the number of twists per inch and so on, and the weaving styles, right? So you can change all of those things and effectively come up with different kinds of sensors. I'm just trying to see if I can show you a picture of one of our... Yeah. So if you look at this picture, for instance, right, this is one piece of fabric, but actually it has multiple different yarns along it. And actually, this is a very absorbing zone, which has a different weaving style. And then your test and control lines here have again, different reagent coated yarns. So in one loom, effectively, you can make, by changing things along this axis, several different things can come together. So it's a very elegant way, I would say, of making capillary kind of sensors. And so then your sample just wicks by absorption, driven by surface tension. And then you have simple color change based results like the home pregnancy test. So that's the kind of idea of the whole fabric sensor.
Great, thanks. I mean, yeah, this is really, really fascinating. I mean, yeah, as I was telling that in 2015, we organized this conference, Indo-French, and you actually presented this work there. I recall, I still recall all those. It was really fantastic. So Ranjay, so a little bit of question on your personal journey, and we got this question again from the audience, and I have added my thing into that. So, you had a secure job with guaranteed salary, in a company. And I mean, with your background, you could have got, many other secured positions, quote unquote. So how difficult was it to take that, that leap of faith that, okay, I will start my own company? And I have added my question here is that what role does family play here?
Yeah, most important, guys, marry the right person. But the part is very, very important. I think your spouse has to kind of really be on board, especially if you're an entrepreneur of any kind, because there's a lot of ups and downs, right? And so I think you definitely want your spouse to understand what this is like and what the journey is like. So I've been very fortunate in that sense. Coming to in terms of like security and so on. See, one thing I would say is that the world is in a place today where even if you kind of jumped into being an entrepreneur, you got one of these 25 and 50 lakh grants I talked about, you can pay yourself a salary. You can't pay yourself the sort of fancy salaries all these kids expect. I'm sure like your IIT Bombay undergrads are probably getting that salary like in a year, right? So you can't use that entire grant to pay yourself, obviously. But if you're willing to at that point in your life take a little bit of that hit, saying, okay, I'll pay myself a third or half of what I'd get out elsewhere, but I'll pay my bills and that. It's certainly something which you can do. And by the way, the reason I'm mentioning this is I'm sure all of you have seen movies like Guru and all that, right? It was very different 25, 30, 40 years ago. You didn't even have that. You had to start by making money day one, correct? There was no money in the bank to begin with. So I think today there's actually some money in the bank to begin with. Maybe there's not enough money to support your market salaries, but there's some money in the bank that can support a good idea. I think that's the difference. And I also am a beneficiary of that, right? I never went a month without paying myself some salary. Even today, I'm probably making less salary than most of these kids will next year, but that's a different thing.
That's true. So just kind of to continuing with the previous question only. So how difficult for you to take that, that jump or, take that challenge personally?
Yeah. See, certainly I was very sure that I wanted to come back to India. I really like the US, by the way. Really like the US, but I said that you like it so much, in fact, that it's very easy to stay back. And we all know that once you stay back in the US for 5 or 10 years, you kind of think of coming back, but you actually never do. So I said, okay, if I don't come back now, I probably won't come back ever. So let's make a serious effort at coming back now before you get into this whole chakkar of H1B and green card and all this. So I, decided to come back well before all those things even began. And the other part certainly motivated me is, to build something in a non-traditional space in India, right? Like as we all know, there's not that many hardware or chemistry and that kind of stories in India. So building something like that out of India is certainly something that still, I think, motivates me. I think we want to build globally relevant companies out of India. So that was a strong motivation.
Great. So actually kind of taking it from there itself. So there are two questions here actually. One you have kind of answered, but still that how useful was your chemical engineering, training, BTech in chemical engineering in your journey? So there was one question that, and the second question was that, is it really necessary to have a PhD, MTech, MBA, etc.?
Yeah. I think on the second question, it goes back to what I said earlier in terms of what is the kind of company that you would like to do, right? I think if you would like to do a technology science driven innovative company, it's probably important to have that PhD or master's thing, right? Because ideas don't come out of a vacuum. I think it's a competitive world out there, even in terms of ideas. And it's usually because, maybe your advisor and all of the background that they have developed over some years, and then you build something on top of that. That's when you come up with something that's relevant enough that can go into the outside world, right? So to imagine that you can, read a few newspaper articles and, journal articles and then just come up with something is a little bit far-fetched. I do see a lot of that, by the way, and there's something I would definitely caution against that. So for instance, people would kind of say that, I've read that this is, cancer is some important problem, and I have this kind of nice idea that why don't we make this kind of CAR T cell or whatever, right, by reading a few headlines. But there's a lot more to it than that. I think if you're going to go into that kind of science and technology driven innovation, you must be very careful to, you have to do a lot of rigorous hard work to kind of estimate exactly what is that differential value add that you're bringing into that space before you go start a company. And the other thing I would say there, Abhijit, also is starting a company in itself is not an end, right? I think for a lot of people, that seems to be the end goal, is to start a company. But I think in some sense, what comes before that is more important. That the idea and what is the value add and is it meaningful? And starting a company is a very mechanical thing, right? You have to go and file a bunch of paperwork, basically. But I think the work done before that is a lot more important.
So actually, as you said, the work done before. So there are. So I have one question here, and then I have added one more. So as a PhD student, if someone already kind of knows that they would like to do into entrepreneurship later on in their life, so how should they prepare themselves? That is my question number one. Do you suggest anything that they should prepare themselves during that journey? And my second question is, that is for myself, is that what role a PhD advisor may play?
Yeah, no, both very important ones. And again, I can go only from my personal experience, obviously, here. And I think in whatever success stories I've seen, the PhD advisor plays a crucial role in any technology driven innovation, right? Because usually it's coming out of their lab. And I think today a lot of PhD advisors and professors are themselves keen on seeing their ideas go out. And as you know, there's a lot of other sort of pressures that are coming today, whether it's from funding agencies or governments and so on, saying, okay, how are you impacting the outside world? So everybody is being asked these questions. And so I think people are just more oriented in that direction in any case. And it goes back to the point, Abhijit, that differential value add that you're bringing in with your technical idea has to usually come from some deep thinking and contemplation. It is not some frivolous thing that you just say, oh, this is cool and let's do it tomorrow, right? It's unlikely that something like that is ever going to work. So in whatever things that I've seen that actually was successful in terms of an idea coming out, company starting and even exiting, it was a result of 2 or 3 years of fairly deep work and pain in terms of understanding what things are, exploring, going wrong a few times, etc. And then saying, okay, this is something that is solving a real problem out there. And so the PhD advisors were significantly involved in supporting. I mean, for example, a PhD student will require, let's say, a bridge postdoc year, right? When they're just finding their feet around a problem. So that kind of thing is best done in your lab. And that's one thing I always say, that do as much as you can on, this kind of government funding, which is non-risky, right? You're not liable to anybody. You're not kind of taken equity or debt or anything. So I think that time is golden. And if you can move a problem forward as much as possible in academia, that's really the best thing before you go and seek any private money.
Yeah. So actually, in the last, while answering the last question, you mentioned something, and I think that is very true. That, as you said, that starting a company is not the end or the thing. I mean, it is one of the very important milestone, but it is a throughout a journey. Something before that and something after that as well. Both are probably equally important. So Pravesh has asked a question: ideas are important or degree is more important?
I guess we've all read all those LinkedIn forwards and all that about like are IIT people getting too many funded too often and so on. So I guess, guys, the IIT degree matters in the sense that your first foot in the door or your first chance, you will likely get easier than other people, right? But after that, you have to kind of make it happen. And I think it's only up to that extent that degrees matter in terms of entrepreneurship. And yes, today entrepreneurship in India seems to be heavily biased towards people from IITs because, I mean, honestly, a lot of VCs, I think, like IIT teams, and this is going off on a tangent, but it's just that I think capitalism on steroids, as we all know today, where effectively VCs are deciding which companies are successful, right? And they like to back people that have branded degrees. So that's the way the world is going. I don't think it's a good thing, but that's the way that things happen today. However, I mean, if you look at things organically, obviously, more than idea, it's execution. I would say that's important. I think there are many ideas, right? We can all sort of talk for the next half an hour and come up with 10 interesting ideas, which, if solved, would be great. But then, with the execution, the team, perseverance, all of those are much more important.
Yeah, my postdoc mentor, Professor Jyotsna Dhawan from NCVS instead, her. So she used to tell that ideas are, worth a penny, but unless you actually execute it, and then you will actually really get to know what are the challenges.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think many of the questions that you have kind of addressed. One of the question actually I would like to again repeat that importance of BTech training. I think for many of our BTech students that is an important message can be from you.
Yeah, I think there is no doubt that, like I said, some of the aspects of chemical engineering stand you in good stead no matter what, right? Mass balances can be extended to cash flow balances, to, I don't know, like GDP of economies. And, you can, so these things are useful everywhere. I think there's no doubt about it. Obviously, more specific aspects of the chemical engineering training are, it depends on what you kind of go and do after that. But I think generally speaking, one lesson from my own BTech, and I can tell you I did not follow this all the time, is just, I think, go to class a lot. You have some great professors. Make sure that you go to class and listen, right? I think, I think that makes up honestly for 70-80% of things. I think if you just did that, you will do quite decently. But in terms of how much is something exactly relevant to what you do? I mean, most things honestly in life are not like that. It is more the rigor and discipline of doing something right that will serve you in good stead for the future, right? So I think just showing up in IIT is not good enough for life. That much is for sure.
Yeah, so as you said, so the students here who were taught by me in that course are transport phenomena. So I used to tell them that the everything in life, if you think of it, is flow, driving force, resistance, and some coefficient. And many of the times you have to reduce the resistance, increase the driving force.
Absolutely.
Coefficient may not be at your control, but that's how you.
Absolutely. And I think you're right, Abhijit. I mean, even that's why so many chemical engineers have gone into, whether it's some bioinformatics or, protein modeling or climate change. I mean, all of these things, ultimately, you can use many of these principles in all of those places. So I think at least kind of taking those things away is very important. I think also things like numerical methods. Today, again, thanks to all this data science and that being so hot at this point, being on top of matrix algebra and differential equations and so on is going to give you an edge, I think, in terms of being able to even go into some area like that, where you may not really use any science principles anymore. But then I think that knowledge of maths is definitely useful. You will stand above your average Coursera person who has kind of learned something for 3 months, right? If you kind of know what's behind all those algorithms, that definitely counts for something eventually.
There is one question that came from Afan. He asked, Sir, I am in third year and have a business model. What is the right time to start actually working? Or should I take a job and keep researching on my idea and start working on it if after taking some experience in job?
Yeah, I mean, without knowing any further information, I would strongly advise the latter.
Yeah.
Because I think, I mean, you're all just going to be 21 coming out. There's, if you think about sort of the time in your life when you can take some significant risks, right? You have a good decade, right? And I think going out there, kind of looking at the real world, real problems, figuring out, even things like interpersonal dynamics, how companies are run, how people are motivated. These are all very important before you might do your own enterprise. And there might be some exceptions to this and that's the one thing I would say to you people is like, yeah, you'll always say, oh, there's a Mark Zuckerberg who seemed to have like figured this out when he was 19 years old. He never had a boss in his life, right? But these are definitely exceptions. And I think, for the average person, it's still, I think, important to know all of these things, right? So that's what, without knowing any further information, that's what I would say.
Coming back to your work, your part of work. So, how challenging it was to bring your, the work that you did at MIT abroad, and then bringing that and applying in India, or so. What
Yeah.
are the real challenges involved there?
So it was the same thing, Abhijit. Even there, I think a lot of the challenge, honestly, was defining a good problem. So in our case, it was okay. As you know, point of care diagnostics could mean hundreds of different things. So then, doing the work of articulating that, okay, it should be immunoassays, it should be in a small lab setting, it should be XYZ test, it should be at this price, it should be with this convenience factor. I mean, that's where a lot of the detailed work goes in. And I mean, all of that can take several years to get right. So, yes, there was sort of this core sensor technology platform, but kind of adapting it into the right configuration and tailoring it to some real need. All of these things have a lot of work, and I would not even call it a finished story yet, right? So, it's an ongoing process, even to now, I would say.
So we are kind of coming to the end of our discussion, but I mean, as I took your permission earlier that we can probably keep it a little longer than the. Someone who is kind of, would like to start their company, or, the budding entrepreneur, after completing all of the things that you have suggested, like that came up during the discussion also. But now suppose a person did the thorough thinking, have a cool idea and ready to start. Then at that point, what challenges he or she may face, or what will be your advice for them?
Yeah, so again, I mean, it comes back to if it's a very technology, science driven innovation, I would say it is better to stay in academia till the point that you get to a prototype or a working model, something that you can demonstrate to other people and get some early private funds and things for it. If it's much more of a very commercial innovation, I mean, there's no harm going out there immediately, right? And I think all these kids probably know better than you and I. Where if you're starting the next Swiggy or whatever, like you don't need to be sitting inside IIT. Right? You probably have to come to Bombay and find an accommodation in Koramangala and be knocking the doors of all the VCs. So that's what you'll have to be doing. So it depends very much on what's the kind of idea that you have and what it is that you would like to do.
No, but if we think of the technology innovation driven kind of idea, suppose the prototype is also done at this moment.
Yes.
Now you are actually ready to step outside. Now, so say someone got some big grant or BIRA grant and did the initiative. Now they are looking for further expansion. Now, what would be your, advice?
See, the first thing that anybody who is a more seasoned kind of investor type looks for is, okay, paying customers, right? That's the next step. Now you've made something that who is the likely customer and do you have a price point, and what could be your margins and all of those things. So it now depends on whether there's still a gap to be filled there. And the best situation to be in is if you can get it to a point where there's even one paying customer, correct? That's a point at which you definitely will get taken more seriously. That means you've actually managed to bridge your idea with a market need in some small way. And most investors in India are comfortable funding operational kind of risk, right? That is, you've demonstrated some technology or concept works, you've even found one early customer, and now you want to go from 1 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000. These are things that people are a lot more comfortable funding, where they say, oh, okay, you have this team, now we need this many more people, we have to build an operation like this, you have to build your whatever other administrative and legal and all those functions and really build a company around. That kind of thing, I think if you're in that kind of situation, there's a lot more ability to get funded today. But if you are still in a thing where, okay, we've built something and then now we need to further refine it and then go and so on, I guess that's where, within the government system itself, right? Like you talked about big, then you can go to BIPP and hopefully get, let's say, somebody in Mumbai Angels to match it or things like that, right? Where you need maybe on the order of, let's say, 1, 2, 3 crores, that kind of money. And hopefully that takes you to the paying customers and so on. There are, I have to say, a number of things where even 1, 2, 3 crores is not enough, right? If you take even the kind of things that we are doing, or drugs for that matter, where even $5 or $10 million might be a small number before you get to your first revenue. These are, I would say, still quite challenging in the Indian context to get funded. There are very few people willing to fund those kinds of things. So I think as things stand today, you want to try and get something to a paying customer as soon as possible. That gives you the strongest chance of success. Hopefully, this will change. We'll get more science and engineering driven innovation and funding. But I think we're in the early days of that still.
Great. So I have come to my last question so far. So I am asking the audience, if you have any more questions, please put it on the Q&A box. One question, so that is the last question from my side, is that we often discuss about what, as an academy and from academia point of view, what we expect from the industry. Now, from industry side, if I think of you as from industry side, what do you expect from the academia in terms of training our students, or even in terms of the collaboration for that matter?
Yeah. See, I think this is an interesting question, Abhijit, because I've always, coming from my background, I like to interact with academics, right? Because I feel, okay, these are people that I've been similar in training to and so on. But the resources of a small company are obviously limited compared to, let's say, Reliance or Tata or whatever. On the other hand, I've heard it from many academics before that it's difficult to make headway with those kinds of companies, right? In terms of seriously pitching an idea, right? So I think there is a gap definitely there in terms of this innovation to something coming out. And still Indian companies are of a mindset, very broadly I'm saying, where they want you to give them a banaya thing to sell,
Yeah.
And where ideally even some little bit of market research has been done, and some brochures and collateral are ready and packaging, and they say, "Acha, ye hai. Oh, this is great. What's the price point? Now let's go sell it." Right? That is a conversation you will find a lot of people. They'll be happy to have that conversation with you. But the moment you say that, okay, look, I have this thing. It could be interesting, but we'll have to invest 2 years and about 1 crore into this to make it work. Suddenly, there's a lot fewer people, I think, willing to do that as companies. I think that's where the DBT, the BIRAC and all that has been very helpful in terms of bridging that, correct?
Yes.
And getting something. So I think the only learning for me in that whole thing is try and use those meager resources to get to a sellable product as soon as possible. I think where we are in India today, that's honestly the only way out, because getting from companies large investments into risk capital is still not, I think, easily going to happen in our space.
But the way, so my question was also that the way we train the students,
Okay.
from that point of view, do you think that we should do something differently? Say, for example, many of the times we get to see that we don't do enough hands-on kind of things, makerspace kind of things. So
Yeah.
so do you think in terms of our training, do
Uh,
you see somewhere we need to really change or something?
I see. Yeah. Look, I have to say I'm not very familiar with exactly what training it is today because it's 20 years ago that I graduated. But definitely, I think we all appreciate people with good hands-on skills. And I think the one thing that I would say is, let's say even you're a chemical engineer, correct? But the ability to use, let's say, Arduino or Raspberry Pi to quickly make some circuit to do some XYZ thing, right? These are things that if somebody has that confidence and ability to do that, even if that's not their exact training, that's the kind of thing that is useful to companies, right? May not be exactly their skill set, but do they have that can-do thing? And that's one thing I have seen, by the way, is a lot of even smaller. I mean, some of the private engineering colleges, there people have a lot of that can-do thing, right? And there's no doubt that the IIT kids are all very smart, correct? But it takes a combination of those two things, I think, to be really successful. I don't know specifically as profs what you people can do. I'm sure that you have a lot of practical things already happening. But I guess tailoring that a little bit more to the modern world. So it could be things like this, whether it's 3D printing or Arduino and Raspberry Pi and so on. I think for everybody to have some knowledge of those things is certainly a useful thing today, tinkering with their hands, laser cutters, all of these things.
So we are actually going to build one makers bhavan here in IIT Bombay, where the idea is that there will be, the microfabs and the biolabs, and students will be free to go there and play with the toys. So that is essentially the overall idea.
Sure.
Okay, Dhananjay. So it was really nice talking to you, and thank you for your time. And I think, I have learned a lot actually through this conversation, and I was taking notes, in fact, and I am sure the students also got really benefited. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for organizing this and for inviting me.
And before we conclude, I would like to invite 𝐃𝐸𝐻𝐿 Jain to give the vote of thanks. 𝐃𝐸𝐻𝐿, over to you.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes, 𝐃𝐸𝐻𝐿, you are.
I'm 𝐃𝐸𝐻𝐿 and I'm the overall coordinator for AZeotropy 2021. And I would first like to thank Dr. Dhananjay for taking out his time and giving us such a good talk. It was very enlightening for all of us, as we students are really interested in entrepreneurship field, and we got to learn a lot from this. Also, thank you to Abhijit Majumder sir for moderating this session. It was kind of interactive and we really liked the session a lot. So thank you for taking out your time. And also thank you to all the attendees for attending this session. And we'll put the recording of the session soon on our YouTube channel. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you, 𝐃𝐸𝐻𝐿. Thanks, Dhananjay. Take care. Bye-bye. Stay safe.
You
Bye.
too.